He did not start with a weapon. He started with a smile, a uniform, and paperwork. By his early 20s, Frank Abagnale Jr. had signed checks he wasn't allowed to sign, walked through airports he shouldn't have had access to, and stood in hospitals and courtrooms as someone he was not. Pilot, doctor, lawyer. He was none of them. But for a while, the world around him acted as if he was. This is the story of Frank Abagnale, the con man whose talent for living fake lives made him a legend of impersonation. Keep one fact in view as the legend grows: impersonation is not a magic trick. It is a negotiation between a performer and an audience that desperately wants the room to stay simple. The setup begins with a teenager who did not feel in control of his life. Abagnale grew up in New York. His parents' marriage fell apart when he was still young, and the stability he thought he could count on started to fracture. He ran. Like many runaways, he did not have a plan. What he had was observation. He watched how quickly adults shifted their tone depending on who they thought they were talking to. A teenager in street clothes could be brushed off. A man in uniform could be deferred to. He saw adults being taken seriously, not because of who they were as people, but because of what they appeared to represent: the uniform they wore, the badges they carried, the titles on their doors. In the world he drifted into, authority often looked like costume. And costume, he realized, was something you could copy. He also learned something quieter. Most people do not want to be rude. Doubt can feel impolite, and politeness, in the wrong moment, becomes an open door. The opportunity he exploited was not a single legal loophole. It was a social one. In the 1960s, you could not Google a resume. Credentials were checked through phone calls, letters, and trusting the right kind of introduction. If you looked like you belonged inside a system, if you used the right phrases, wore the right clothes, and carried the right documents, many people assumed the rest. That human shortcut saved time. It also opened the door to someone like Abagnale. The irony is sharp. Systems designed to move professionals efficiently ended up moving an imposter even faster. The plan he developed had a few consistent parts. First, pick a role that commands trust: airline pilot, doctor, lawyer. Second, learn enough surface detail to sound plausible. Third, forge or acquire physical symbols of that role: an ID card, a jacket, a badge, a stack of printed checks. Fourth, move through environments where people want to believe you are who you say you are, because it keeps their own day running smoothly. One of his most famous identities was as a Pan Am pilot. He did not fly planes, but dressed in a uniform, carrying a pilot's bag, and walking with the posture of someone on a tight schedule, he could leverage airline culture itself. Airports were full of people used to seeing crew move freely. Hotel staff were used to checking in flight crews without interrogation. Other pilots were used to quick, casual recognition, not deep background checks. There is another layer beneath the uniform. Pilots carried an aura of responsibility. People wanted to believe the man in the jacket was trained, tested, and accountable, because the alternative is too stressful for a normal Tuesday. Abagnale studied those gestures and rhythms. He learned where to stand, how to talk, and what to say about routes and schedules to sound like one of them. He learned what not to say, how to avoid the technical questions that would expose a fake. Confidence is not only what you claim. It is what you refuse to discuss without looking defensive. Then he used that access to move around the country and to cash fraudulent checks, leaning on the halo of the brand stitched across his jacket. If a bank teller saw Pan Am pilot on a check and a confident young man in uniform in front of them, suspicion dropped. He did not need every detail to be perfect. He needed the first 5 seconds of impression to be perfect. The same pattern appeared in his other roles. In one phase, he presented himself as a doctor in a hospital setting, observing and supervising more than performing deep procedures, using charm and caution to stay away from tasks that would expose him. Hospitals are hierarchies built on trust in symbols: the coat, the chart, the calm voice at the nurse's station. Abagnale's survival strategy was to occupy the edges, Enough authority to move, not enough responsibility to be tested in a single catastrophic moment. Colleagues trusted the lab coat and the title more than they trusted their own lingering doubts. In another, he attached himself to legal environments as if he were a lawyer, leaning on forged credentials and the deference people show to titles. Courts and offices run on procedure, but procedure still begins with appearances. Who is allowed past the rail? Who carries the folder? Who speaks as if they belong? The theme was always the same: charm, confidence, loopholes in verification, and a keen eye for how little most people actually check once someone looks right and sounds right. The execution of his cons relied on two engines. The first was social engineering, manipulating how people saw him. The second was check fraud, manipulating how money moved on paper. He experimented extensively with altering checks, creating new ones, and exploiting bank processing lags across state lines. In a world before instant digital clearing, a check could feel like cash for a little while, even when it wasn't. Abagnale treated that delay as a runway. He would deposit or cash forged instruments, move on before the bank realized the problem, and repeat the pattern elsewhere. There is a cold lesson in that rhythm. Fraud often depends on distance, geographic distance, time distance, institutional distance. When everything connects instantly, many old tricks stop working. His fake identities helped smooth the financial con. People want to believe that a pilot or a doctor or a lawyer is good for the money. That belief did not come from careful analysis of his account history. It came from a narrative. For a time, the narrative worked. He traveled widely, lived well, and stayed ahead of many people who realized too late that something did not add up. But impersonation at that scale has an expiration date. The fallout began when patterns emerged. Law enforcement agencies, banks, and companies started comparing notes. Incidents that looked separate at first began to look like part of a larger path. Names that had been just another file in a drawer became pins on a shared board. The same face, the same style, the same timing, repeating across states and borders. The FBI became a central player in tracking him down. In the version of the story popularized later, much attention goes to the cat-and-mouse tension between Abagnale and specific agents. Behind the drama was something simpler: paper trails that finally caught up. Investigations like this often look unglamorous in daylight. Ledgers, signatures, timestamps, travel records, mismatched names that only become obvious when someone finally lays them side by side. As the circle tightened, it became harder for him to keep rotating identities fast enough to avoid recognition. Eventually, he was arrested overseas and faced the kind of institutions he had spent years pretending to belong to. Prison time followed. The ending of his story, though, is not a straight line from punishment to disappearance. Abagnale later cooperated with authorities, providing insight into fraud methods and eventually working as a consultant on security and document design. That arc from con man to advisor is its own controversy in some circles, especially as later reporting has questioned elements of his original claims and timeline. Some listeners want a redemption arc that fits neatly. Others hear a warning: the same charisma that convinces a teller can convince a crowd unless facts are pinned down early. For our purposes, one core truth remains. Frank Abagnale's legend exists because he exposed how much of authority is costume and choreography. His story forces uncomfortable questions. How many systems grant trust based on first impressions? How much do uniforms, titles, and printed forms do the thinking for us? And how many of the safeguards we rely on today are stronger in code and weaker when a convincing human stands in front of us? The legacy of his fake lives is not just entertainment. It is a warning about how easy it can be to step into roles when everyone else is moving too fast to verify. If you run a bank, a hospital, or an airline, the lesson is procedural. Trust must have checkpoints that do not depend on charisma. If you're an ordinary person in an ordinary day, the lesson is smaller and harder. The uniform is not a character reference. The confident voice is not proof. The hurry you feel to keep the line moving is exactly what a skilled imposter wants. In an age of digital identities and online scams, his tricks look analog, but the pattern hasn't gone away. People still fall for imposters who speak the right language, wear the right badge, and offer the right story. Abagnale's story endures because it is sharper than the movie gloss, not just a stylish chase, but a blueprint for how charm, confidence, and loopholes in verification can turn a teenager into a man who lived a dozen fake lives. And it endures because the audience senses the uncomfortable part. The systems did not fail from stupidity alone. They failed from habit, from the everyday decision to trust a symbol because the day is long and the line behind you is growing. That habit is human. That is why the story stays relevant, because the con changes costumes. But the pressure to trust does not, day after ordinary day, again and again.